first got married, we would take seasonal trips down to Florida once or twice a year, mostly for the great weather and also to get a little surfing in. We were both born and raised in California, grew up surfing, but didn't actually meet and get romantically involved until we were both living in the Midwest for work. The closest beach for our kind of recreation was just a hop and a skip away. We didn't have friends or family in Florida, so these trips were literally just for us, to satisfy our beach cravings, and even the urge to be out in the sun. Because we didn't have family to visit, we just randomly selected a different coastal town each trip and stay somewhere brand new every time we went down. Being young newlyweds, we weren't making a ton of income. Our savings were all but non-existent. We had to be cheap on these road trips, which meant no hotels, period. Not on the journey, and not after arriving in whatever town we picked previously. We drove a Subaru that had a decent amount of room in it, and we'd save several $100s by just sleeping in it. This was my wife's method of curving our budget, and being an outdoorsman my entire life, I was on board from the moment. She mentioned camping. My wife, Kat, didn't have traditional camping in mind, though this was the early 2000s. So stealth camping wasn't quite as mainstream as it is now. Kat had heard about stealth camping from a co-worker who was a cross-country bicyclist. Her co-worker explained that while on these incredibly long pedaling trips, sometimes the only place to get safety and to get some rest is in a parking lot or the green belt between two businesses. Bikers would pack meager supplies, just enough to keep them going, and then supplement those supplies with whatever they could buy on the road. These bikers would carry light sleeping gear, maybe a tent or just a tarp, and rudimentary stuff like sun blinds or can openers to add a touch of convenience. So we'd start making this part of our Florida trips. We'd load up our Subaru with all kinds of odds and ends. Things that I imagine Boy Scouts would pack. Toothpicks, lighters, a rope, sandwich bags, and batteries. All the little things that you don't really think about until you need them. Everything would be filed away in a neat little stack, along with our bedding to make for a perfect traveling sleep capsule. Kat even had dangling drapes that encircled the back area for privacy. For the better part of 4 years, we had zero issues with our urban stealth camping. The only problem that we encountered was that many of these coastal towns that we were visiting had pretty good curfews and ordinances, so we couldn't overnight in beach parking lots or in front of stores or businesses of any kind. So we had to find places where people parked on the street, and again, for these small coastal towns in Florida, this wasn't a common occurrence. Everyone had a garage or a driveway, so our little Subaru camper stuck out like a sore thumb and never failed though. We would always find some little neighborhood or development where people did use the street. We blend in for a few days, maybe even a week, then hit the road for home. There were showers and facilities at the beach, all kinds of outdoor amenities. But the simple act of just finding a place to shack up for the night that always proved to be the most difficult. Camping in plain sight actually takes a little bit more creativity than folks give us credit for. During one particular trip, we were having an impossible time trying to find a place to set up. It was our first night in town, and by this point in the evening, we've been driving in circles through the community for 3 hours, with absolutely no luck on an inconspicuous place to park. Finally, though, after following some windy roads that took us through a more rural neighborhood, we found a little stretch between the beach and some houses where people did park on the road. We pulled in on one end, where the neighborhood stopped and the road snaked off into the dark, and called it home. We started on our usual bedtime routines, like brushing our teeth, washing our faces out of the water, getting comfy, locking the doors, and snuggling in for bed. There was a commotion outside, though, as we heard walking around and a little talking. Soon someone was climbing into the car that was parked nearest to us, maybe 250 feet behind us, far away enough that we weren't really concerned. They fire up the car and roll off down the lane, only to leave us behind. pretty much alone out there on the street. There was now only one other car parked on the roadway, and it was hundreds of feet behind us. I was worried that they'd be leaving any minute now. Getting a ticket wasn't really in our budget. Kat and I discussed our options, but we were kinda trapped. After driving all day, only to drive even more around town, we didn't have it in us to start the car and look for a more populated area. As we were talking though, our prayers were answered. On the front windshield, we could see a pair of headlights cut up the road the opposite direction and stop somewhere ahead of us. I climbed up and pulled the curtains back, only to find a big dusty van parked about 75 feet off. The second I saw it though, I got this weird feeling from the bottom of my feet to the top of my throat. Something was off, and I let my wife know immediately. She popped up herself, took one look at it, and then got back under the covers. It was creepy, but we were in the middle of a neighborhood, and that was the whole point. We were safe and needed to be incognito, not be suspicious and draw attention to any passing vehicle. She was right, and frankly, I admired her for her undaunted courage, but I didn't like the van, nor how close it was to us. From my place behind the curtain, I watched someone fire up a cigarette in the driver's seat of the van and proceed to smoke it while looking right at our car. I couldn't do it. I told Kat that I was going to sit watch for a bit because everything was just a little creepy. She said whatever, rolled over, and then promptly passed out. I slithered up into the front seat and got comfy behind the wheel. We were parked against the moon and had a decent tent. I was wearing dark clothing, kind of a perfect storm for not being seen behind the windshield. The whole time I just watched this hand go back and forth with the cherry of the cigarette. No smoke escaped the window, not even a whisper. Anyone smoking with the windows up is a total psycho, if you ask me. That being said, my paranoia was now at an all-time high, and to this day, I've never been so suspicious of a person. But I couldn't let it rest. After 30 or 40 minutes of just staring that van down, I finally decided that I was going to go for the long haul. I'd see the sunrise if I had to. Whatever it took to make sure this guy went away. I got the jet boil, the percolator, everything I would need to make a quick, quiet pot of coffee. I set the whole thing up outside the car, on the ground, on the passenger side, so I could stay somewhat hidden from anyone driving by or looking out from their window. I also wanted to force the action. I got tired of watching that van and waiting for something to happen. So I got out and essentially offered a challenge to anyone that wanted to mess with us. Here I am out in the open, no tricks to be pulled. I watched the night sky, listened to the heat whirring beside me, and then I heard the click and slam of a car door opening and closing. I look over, and there's that guy from the van, awkwardly staring at me across that 75-foot gap. And then almost immediately, he starts walking right toward me, one hand in his pocket. He didn't seem panicked or intimidating or anything, just the energy of a man running an errand. I, on the other hand, was low-key tripping out just underneath my skin. This was what I wanted to happen with my open challenge to the world, right? But now, he was coming over. I realized that I bit off a little more than I can chew, and now I was about to choke. I took a deep breath just before he got within earshot, reminded myself that everything was fine. I had a 14-inch Bowie knife laying in the dirt beside me, something my wife and I traveled with everywhere we went. I was going to use it, hopefully to scare this guy off at the first sign of trouble, and if not, very soon. In his chest before he could kill me or my wife. He gets within 25 feet and just stands there, more of that awkward energy. The more the guy does, the more strange that he seems. His hands go in and out of his pockets. He pushes his hair back a few times and then finally comes over, within talking distance. He says hello and asks me, "How's it going?" We share some very brief small talk before you ask me for some matches. The only matches that we had are in the car, but I do have a lighter for the jet boil, so I hand it over and explain that he can just keep it. He seems blown away by this, like he's never received a kinder act of generosity. Continues to thank me over and over again. After a string of thank yous comes to a final end, it goes back to just awkwardly standing there. That's when it occurs to me how big this dude is. 6'2" at the very least. He's broad too, a well-built fella. But it was so dark that his dimensions were hard to discern at first. Now that I sized him up, I was a little uncomfortable again. His awkwardness came off as apprehension, like maybe he was about to jump me or something. You better believe that I had that knife tucked in my waistband just underneath my shirt. It was still in the sheath, so honestly, it would have been a pain to get out and use, but having it close was relieving. I poured 2 cups of coffee in the disposable throwaway cups that me and my wife used. I offered up one to the guy. I told him that I was staying awake for a bit, for a photography shot, as I was an amateur photographer. This part was actually true, but there wasn't any shot that I was looking for. This was just an up and down lie, short of the being an amateur photographer part. That's about the time that this guy decided to dive into his backstory. The stranger told me his name, something I still don't remember, and that he'd very recently been released from prison. He was moving along the coastline on his way to Miami, where he had a job lined up. I nodded along, more interested than you could believe. I could have easily earned an Academy Award with the performance that I put on. Like I was this guy's old high school coach, and he was catching me up on his life or something. Honestly, I wasn't paying attention to what he was saying at all. I was all caught up in a panic, letting one hand rest near the knife in my waistband while looking for signs of aggression in his body language. None ever came, but I was still on high alert. I told the guy that I wished him luck and was going to be turning in soon myself. He said thanks again, then milled around the area for a little bit longer before climbing back into his own van. I saw him light another cigarette and just went back to lounging in the van. For whatever reason, he continued to stare at us. Red flags and alarms had been going off in my head all night, but here I was, somewhere around 2 in the morning, and I hadn't slept any yet. My interaction with that guy was very creepy, but nothing so scary that I needed to run in the other direction. I convinced myself that he was a guy just down on his luck while I put my coffee supplies away, then slipped into the front seat and watched the area for a few minutes before deciding to turn in. But just as I turned to climb back into the bed space with Kat, something caught my eye. I saw movement along the vegetation between the road and the beach, a shadow at first, but soon I could make out the undeniable figure of a man, one even larger than the guy that I was just talking to. He skulked along the underbrush until he was level with the van, then crossed in front of it and climbed into the passenger's seat. He was very careful with the handle, as I couldn't hear it open nor latch when he silently pulled it closed. The guy was going the extra mile to make sure that no one knew that he was out there. Great. Not one, but 2 ex-convicts roaming around not 100 feet from where my wife and I are trying to sleep. I slammed the key into the ignition and flooded the area with my high beams. Right there in front of me, I could see both guys sitting in front seats of the van, and they gave me a creepy, rotten grin through the glass. The driver held up the lighter and waved it back and forth at me. My wife asked me what the hell was going on, but I just shifted the car in a drive and whipped around to get deeper into town. The logical thing would have been to blow right past them, so I hadn't been down the stretch of road, and that was literally where they'd come from. But we were definitely more familiar. If I was going to have an advantage, it would be to go where town thickened up and more people could intervene. I'll never forget looking up through my rear view and through the flailing fabrics of the blind, seeing that van peel off the shoulder and come rolling after us. They didn't turn their headlights on, but simply followed along in the dark. I could only see the grille and the headlights by the glow of my red backlights. It was a very haunting visual. I did my best to quickly explain to Kat what the hell was going on, all while she's sliding from wall to wall in the back of the car. I told her that the guy in the van was released from prison this week and had a friend that he didn't mention sneaking around in the dark around our car. As he didn't mention him, I assume his intentions were probably not good. He was likely casing our situation, seeing if we had anything of value. That kind of thing. It only took Kat one peek out of the back window, where she saw the glowing silver grille of that van coming up right behind us, for her to agree that I made the right call. It was time to get the hell out of there, and we had to do it now. Fortunately for us, the neighborhood led right into a well-lit community. Suddenly, that dusty piece of shit van wasn't so scary behind us. They actually looked like assholes, racing and squealing around. They backed off after barely a quarter of a mile and looped back into the darkness near the beach. I drove us to the nearest pharmacy, parked under a light pole, and did my best to fall asleep. The worst-case scenario would be waking up to a ticket, but at that point, I was just lucky to not have been robbed. We lucked out yet again, as Kat and I just snoozed away the morning and woke up without incident. We caught the best lunch that we've ever had, and the cold cuts were unbelievable. We didn't see that van again, and frankly, kind of lost interest in stealth camping. It's been hotels and Airbnbs for us ever since. Personally, I've only ever gone stealth camping one time, and it was during a 2-day drive between where I was going to college and my hometown. The drive itself was about 20 hours. And the town that was smack dab in the middle of that drive was Moab, Utah. I had never been to Moab, but I guess maybe driven through it once, but I'd heard about it just like we all have. That it's paradise for rock climbers, rock crawlers, off-roaders, and outdoorsmen in general. I grew up hiking and camping, so I was kind of excited to see what the town would have to offer for a passerby. As I was planning this trip, I was trying to keep it as cheap as possible. As I mentioned earlier, I was in college at the time, and this was my first trip home for the holidays. I was kind of feeling everything out in terms of what this trip would cost so I could properly budget out for the future. My first budget cut would be a hotel room. I was driving my old Jeep Cherokee, and Moab was such an outdoor-friendly community. I figured there would be a plethora of campgrounds in that area. I'd just roll into one for one quick overnight for 5 or 6 hours. The day finally came. I packed up my Jeep and hit the road. Everything went exactly to my plan, cutting through the miles until finally, right down at sunset, I got within 10 or 20 miles of Moab. It was so plain out there. No trees or forest from what I could see in the fading sunlight. I didn't worry though. I figured I'd be sleeping in my car anyway. I didn't need trees or forest to do that. By the time I got into Moab though, it was completely dark. I didn't have any idea where to go in terms of camping. This was well before smartphones. So all I had were the Google Map printouts, which I used to piece together a rough idea. Soon I had a campground pegged one just outside of town along the beautiful stretch of the Colorado River. To my memory, it was called Goose Nest Campground, something like 2 miles east of the town limits. Yes, I had Googled if there were campgrounds, but what I failed to learn was that these were paid for, highly sought-after campgrounds. I couldn't just roll into one and use it. The second I did this, I had multiple campers from other units walking me down with flashlights, asking to see a permit or some kind of paperwork, anything saying that I paid to be there. It was probably to keep out the riffraff, and after this happening to me 2 or 3 times, I was too spooked to stick around. I didn't feel friendly, and I thought I was ruining a peaceful night for all these campers, not expecting a stranger to come driving through their area. After getting ran out of those campgrounds, I cruised back into Moab, decided I would just sleep in the parking lot, something like a Walmart or a Denny's, where there's a 24-hour bathroom. I didn't really need comfortable living, I just needed basic stuff to get me to morning. I was really banking on sleeping in the middle of nowhere, but my experience thus far had me hesitant to even go off-roading. Who knows what kind of shit I'd come up on out there. There was no luck for me in town either. The place was crawling with crackheads and weirdos. Every parking lot that I investigated had at least one unsavory-looking guy, if not 5 or 6 of them, shuffling around, up to no good. This was not what I had in mind for such a well-known destination. Absolutely defeated, I decided that I would sleep in the middle of nowhere. I got my Jeep back on the highway and rolled maybe 3 miles south of town and hooked onto the first dirt road that I saw. There was a little cattle guard laid in between some barbed wire fencing, but aside from that, the place was wide open. There were some bluffs that I couldn't see over, so I just decided to park along the little ridge that partially blocked my car, still very cautious of my surroundings. I decided to drape one of my blankets that I had across the windshield and the front windows to keep unwanted eyes outside of my cab. Then I insulated myself up front with my legs across the console and button, the driver's seat, my back against the door, and placed my feet in the passenger seat. It definitely wasn't the most comfy thing ever, but I had a lot of stuff packed in the back. Plus, I wanted to be ready if anything got weird. I got to my spot just in time around 9 p.m., way later than I originally planned. My new plan was to catch some quick sleep and be up by 4, get myself ready and back in town, gas up, and then be back on the highway at sunrise around 5 a.m. It was bare minimum, but again, that was all I needed to get through. Literally bare minimum. Basic survival stuff. Something rumbled me awake in the early hours, just before the time that I wanted to be awake. I cracked an eye open, and outside the Jeep was a big dirt hauler, some kind of tractor truck. It was idling, and just around the blanket curtain that I put up, I could see a guy looking down at me from the cab. Not a minute later, he rumbled off into the desert around one of the bluffs, and then disappeared. I didn't put much more thought into it, and just tried to go back to sleep. I figured it was some kind of laborer of some kind, and this was his pickup route. A truck that size wasn't up to anything spooky. Not but 30 minutes later, I hear banging on the passenger side window. I crack an eye open and checked my watch, just shy of when my alarm was going to go off. I assumed that I was about to get shooed off by the police, or maybe the Forest Service, as the timing would line up with the truck that just drove off by earlier. I yanked the blanket down to find an old beater Chevy outside, with a guy staring holes through the glass at me. I started to wave, but before I could, someone bangs on the window directly behind my head. They banged on it so hard that it rattled my teeth, and I slowly began to realize I'm completely surrounded. I turn, and sure enough, there's another guy that looks a lot like the first. Plain t-shirt, Levi's boots. They both start hollering for me to get out of the car. For whatever reason, I obliged. I wanted understanding, just to let these guys know that I was just passing through. I meant no harm. This turned out to be a huge mistake on my part. The second that I unlocked the vehicle, the guys yanked both doors open, pulled me out of the car by my arms and my shoulders. Once they had me on the ground, one sat on me, while the other went through everything that I had, starting with my glove box. Saying it was a thorough investigation would be an understatement. I watched while this guy turned my front seats upside down, dumped my glove box and console in the dirt, pocketed anything that I had of value. Coins, electronics, you name it. I swear I even saw him take my push-in lighter just because it was shiny. I explained to the guy that was holding me down, I'm a college student. I'm from out of town. I didn't mean any trouble. I was just lost and trying to get some sleep before hitting the road again. The guy literally mocked everything that I said, repeated it back to me in a stupid voice, even slapped me a few times, all while laughing. He didn't care who I was or where I was from. After a few more minutes, the sun crested the hills. Everything was lit up. I don't know how, but I could tell that that made these guys nervous. I could hear cars on the highway which I thought were closer during the night, and now that I could see it, it was a good quarter-mile away from the main stretch of road. How these guys had found me, I couldn't really be sure. I thought I'd done a pretty damn good job of hiding out. Eventually, after 10 or 15 minutes of being pinned to the ground, they just took off. They instructed me not to follow them, not to call the police, or do anything stupid, because if I did, they'd come back and kill me. They were very, very clear about this when they said it to me. Either way, I'd already made up my mind. They didn't really take much from me, mostly just some food and what little cash I had in front with me. After making sure I was okay and intact, I got back in my Jeep, went back towards Moab. It took me a bit, but after making a couple of laps, I found the police department, went in and made a report. At first, they were pretty dismissive, as I was a college-age student, an out-of-state license, and dirty as hell. I probably looked like a crazy vagrant. Only after I explained where this happened did the officers seem to take one of the deputies asked me. I did my best to explain exactly where I pulled off on the road. The deputy turned back to his superiors, and they talked for a moment, going over some notes of prior reports. It turned out that the guys that had robbed me had been making trouble around town for a couple of weeks, and most, if not all, the reports were coming from the south side of town. Furthermore, the dirt road that I pulled off on to get some sleep, well, that road led to a pretty big ranching outfit, and I don't mean a dude ranch resort, but a real agricultural facility. They even had a mine out there on the property, hence the big Mack truck that rolled by me in the early morning hours. Well, a couple of guys had been sneaking in and out of the ranch, usually in the middle of the night. They would come in empty-handed, stumble around the property until they turned on an alarm. Then they would go scurrying back out into the desert with whatever they could grab. Tools, copper, raw ore, building materials, literally anything they could sell into turning a couple of bucks. My misfortune turned into a stroke of luck for the local police department. I took them out to where my incident took place, and from there, the sheriff's department was able to track these assholes down by the end of the day. They found them holed up in a little cave in a wash that intersected with a river. They had water storage, all kinds of stuff to give them actually a livable, decent life. The issue is, they all pillaged locals and travelers like me to get it all. Not after that day, I got all my stuff back, which, as I said, wasn't really that much. Maybe 50 total, along with some of my personal stuff like blankets. I have no idea what happened to all those men, but I'm sure the camp was cleaned up. Missing items returned to owners, and everything else dumped in the trash. From there, I'm sure those dudes got locked up, and I went about my business. Like I said in the beginning, this was my first and only time stealth camping, and I can confidently tell you I'll never, ever do it again. A few years ago, my wife and I were going to go visit her sister somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We're an older couple, but not ancient, not even retired, so we make up all trips like this pretty often. Recently though, or at least within the last 5 years or so, we've been hearing about a new fad called stealth camping. My wife and I thought this was funny as we'd done this kind of thing for years across many different states and many different cities. I'll admit we were fascinated though. We found all kinds of YouTubers and TikTok streamers, people coming up with new ways to camp in more and more populated areas. Some of the stuff that we were seeing was genius, cutting-edge kind of thinking, and some of the other content. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead, and we started simple at first, just sleeping in the car in well-lit parking lots, then slowly transitioned into more isolated methods of camping. Instead of sleeping in a Walmart parking lot, we'd find a luxury condo, or maybe even a gated community, somewhere with a little more security. We'd follow someone inside, find a nice, non-reserved parking place, and sleep away the night without anyone knowing. Dawn would come, and we'd get ourselves ready, roll right out the exit gate as if we'd lived there our whole lives. It was a lot of fun, and always made for some mild excitement. Now, stealth camping isn't quite the same as boondocking, which was something else that my wife and I had done. Boondocking is just breaking camp in the middle of nowhere, generally public land, and that doesn't have services or any amenities. It's essentially just typical camping. We like to stealth camp because it kept you in town limits, and you didn't actually have to get to anything set up. You got to utilize your car in a way that you normally don't get to. Well, after a year of exploring and experimenting in the great fad of stealth camping, we decided to try something new. We visited my sister-in-law. Instead of just using a car, we were going to actually find a place within town and city limits to set up a little camp and sleep outdoors. We'd seen enough videos and practiced enough on our own to feel confident we could get away with it. Looking back, I don't know what the hell we were thinking. This was some ultimate bored, middle-aged white people activities, if such a thing ever existed. Everything on this trip was going good at first. We stopped 3 or 4 nights at this point, all of which were successful outdoor ventures. Now we were actually in the city and needed to be careful with the place that we chose. After getting some food and stretching out our legs, we started shopping around for a place to set up. It wasn't long before we spotted this quaint little greenbelt behind a Target store. It had ominous fencing that didn't actually have a warning of any kind. There was grass and a line of trees, even a little hill to offer a vantage point. By and large, it seemed absolutely perfect. It would make for the most high-profile stealth camping adventure for us yet. Now, you can't just go in and start setting up full camp with people around. We'd have to make several trips to and from our car. What's going on, pal? Oh, hey, come here. What is it? You don't need to do this, man. We were left to do our business. We didn't have a ton of supplies or anything, but we'd like to be comfortable and didn't want to have to return to our car for any reason. As I've been saying, we took it pretty seriously, compared every step of our camping to some videos that we'd seen. We knew all of this had to be safe and secret, so we held ourselves to a certain standard. At the end of the day, though, it was a lot of fun and something to tell our friends about. The camp itself was tucked into a thicket of trees. He's about halfway up that hill, which kept our tent out of view from pretty much every direction. It was a dark nylon, 2-person tent, and so small that it blended in perfectly with the surroundings. Up where the trees were a little flat area to put the tent, which also had a 2-person cot inside. It was very comfortable and kept us off the ground, which did preserve our backs a bit. Again, we're older. You can't blame us for preventing the aches and pains if able to. We settled into a couple of collapsible chairs that we brought along. We spared no luxury with the isolation that we had back there. We talked in hushed voices, shared a snack, and had a little wine and just watched the sky. It was relaxing, very mellow. You almost couldn't tell that we were in the heart of a major metropolitan area. Somewhere behind us, we could faintly hear the drone of the highway. But then we heard something much closer. Tires squealing through the parking lot. The hill wasn't so high that we couldn't see over the Target building, but it was obvious that some kid just whipped in the lot, was doing donuts or something to that effect. Every time that we thought it would stop, they would just cut the wheel and gun it the other direction. It was very off-putting, but not quite enough to be scared or anything. Our car was parked out there, but there were a few other cars too. Random lot overnighters, maybe even graveyard shift workers. There was a stretch in numbers that hopefully whoever this was would be careful enough not to crash into any of the cars. It quieted down after a while, and soon my wife and I were getting ready for bed. There's something about sitting in the dark, especially outdoors, that just drains my battery. It could be 7 p.m., and I'd tell you it was midnight. I just lose all sense of time and want to be asleep the whole time I'm out there. Just as soon as we're getting ready to break down the chairs and go inside our tent, we hear that same car come ripping through the parking lot once again. Except this time, it comes to a screeching halt. My wife and I look at each other. That's new. Then we hear a car door open and shut. A second one. Then we hear footsteps. Voices. Everything is getting louder. My wife and I look at each other in total terror as two strangers pull the fence back and start wandering right into the green belt that we're hiding in. We can hear them clearly now. They aren't talking about anything nice or friendly, mostly violence and drug use. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. My wife starts to get up, but I stopped her, whispered for her to stay put. The trees had us totally blocked from view. The only way we'd be found was through sound. The less movement, the less likely that we'd be caught. She sat back, put a hand over her mouth, and just waited. Thankfully, those voices slowed down as the two strangers stopped short of where we were lingering, down in that flat area before the hill. There was a big fallen tree down there too, bigger around than a car tire and made for a good bench. I considered camping next to it earlier, but found it too close to the fence for comfort, and thank God that we didn't do that, or we would have been discovered almost immediately. Now we just listened to these guys talk for a while. Obviously, we didn't know their names, so I'll just refer to them as Guy 1 and the loud guy. Guy 1 was only a little softer spoken, but talked at such a fast speed that we had a hard time keeping up with him. I'll try to recreate as much of the conversation as I can remember. At first, they were just talking about doing drugs and getting high partying. But eventually, the talks turned into violence. Violent stuff. They'd done stuff they wanted to do, and this eventually led them to why they were out there in the first place. Damn, dude. What time is it? Is he even coming or what? The loud guy asked. Yeah, he said he'd be late. He's always late. Can't wait to do this, Guy once said. Yeah, me too, man. Dude's a scumbag. Loud guy. Agreed. Now they start trailing off about how they were supposed to meet a third person, a drug dealer of some kind. They were going to rip him off right back here. Apparently, they'd bought from this guy pretty regularly, but his prices went up, and his consistency had gone down. Addiction turned to desperation, and both of those turned into anger for Loud Guy and Guy 1. Anger that they planned on using to utilize to rob the person that was causing their problems, or at least so they reasoned. We definitely didn't like what we were hearing, but our options were limited. We were outgunned against these goons, and we had no interest in running them off or tangling up in any way. I had a gun, naturally, but that was an absolute last resort. It was an unspoken agreement that we could just hide, stay quiet, and wait out whatever the hell was about to happen. The second it was clear, we'd call the police and get the hell out. The two goons kept talking about all kinds of creepy, colorful stuff. My wife ended up covering her ears because it was so gross, beyond locker room talk, but the truly heinous daydreams were over. Of the criminally deprived minds. After a while, we heard footsteps approaching from the outside. I prayed for a security guard or someone, but it turned out to be the long-awaited drug dealer. Showtime. They all started exchanging pleasantries, shaking hands. This part actually felt almost cool as my wife and I were the only ones privy to what was really going on, or at least, so we thought. The conversations then turned to business. Loud Guy starts to inquire about their perk, and drug dealer pulls a gun out of his jacket and points it right in Loud Guy's face. What the hell, man? He screams. You didn't say you'd have a gun. There's a lot I didn't tell you. Guy 1 says, now empty out your pockets. This whole exchange was a double setup, as Guy 1 was never gonna rob the drug dealer, what was actually in cahoots with him. Then the second gun came out, a shouldered up, and Loud Guy immediately realized that he was done for his own. The option was to get louder and louder, which for him came pretty easy. They didn't let it happen though. My wife almost gave us up when the drug dealer pistol whipped that Loud Guy not once, but twice. It got really quiet. Guy 1 rolled him over, started working him over, checking his pockets. then literally hog-tying him. Loud Guy started to grumble again. I would thought they were friends. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Guy 1 took a filthy rag from the culvert ditch and stuffed it inside his mouth. Talk about cold-hearted. After that, drug dealer and Guy 1 went through the contents of Loud Guy's pockets. They even took his shoes and his socks off, where I guess the real haul was found. From what we could hear, they came upon 900 in cash, half an ounce of cocaine, and also had piano wire in his pockets, apparently a tool of his. Then, the worst thing that you can imagine happened. My wife's whole body lurched, her eyes went wide, and she let out the loudest sneeze that you can imagine. I froze, totally shocked at what just happened. My first instinct was to say something like, "What the hell?" But I knew that would only add to the fire that we just started. She put a hand over her mouth and nose and did her best not to breathe. She has wicked allergies in the Pacific Northwest. We had forgotten all about it in the moment, and now it was too late. It just got us busted. I watched through the trees as all three heads, even the guy tied up on the ground, slowly turned up to look in our position. The drug dealer even briefly pointed the gun up at us. We didn't move. We didn't give up exactly where we were. We knew the hill was dark and shrouded, especially where our tent was. Much to our surprise, the drug dealer and Guy 1 started to backpedal towards the parking lot. They shouted a few threats, talked some tough guy shtick, and even threw some more shade on Loud Guy, who's still tied up on the ground. My wife and I kept still as they slowly disappeared through the fence and around the side of the building. They hopped inside Guy 1's car, the squealing menace from earlier, as we realized we never actually heard the drug dealers arrive in a vehicle. We surmised that he must have walked from some nearby location to eliminate loose ends. The car tore out of the parking lot, left us alone in that green belt. Alone, except for Loud Guy. He was aggressively rolling back and forth at the bottom of the hill. We could hear him grunting, struggling to get free, but it was no use. After 20 minutes or so, he finally gave up, panting, face down in the dirt. I honestly think he passed out from exhaustion. My wife and I wasted no time, immediately started breaking down camp. The chairs first, then tucked in all our loose equipment into the cooler, like a big stacked up pile. We took the tent apart as quietly as we could, careful not to step on anything that might give us away. Once that was rolled up, we were ready to break for our car. We heard something though. Loud Guy was starting to fight with his bind knees again. Except this time, he was clearly making some progress. It wasn't more than a few seconds later, and suddenly his arms were free, which moved down quickly to get his ankles undone. Soon, he popped up muttering to himself, brushing the dirt off his clothes. My wife and I were frozen. We had no idea what the hell to do. We were already scared enough at just the prospect of trying to walk by this dude, but now he was up and free. He took one final look around the greenbelt, then bolted for the parking lot. We stood and listened to his fading footfalls until we couldn't hear them anymore, then stood and listened some more. We weren't in much of a rush to get caught by any of these people. It was just by pure luck that none of them had come up the hillside to see who or what we were. Once we were positive that everyone was gone, we huffed all of our stuff out to the car and dialed 911 and hit the road. My wife made a full, thorough report, all except for the fact that we were camping behind Target. The dispatcher assured my wife that lots of calls came out of this part of town. Apparently, we've been trying to camp in one of the more crime-ridden areas of the city. We'd never heard anything more about the trio of drug-dealing turncoats. And believe it or not, my wife and I continued to stealth camp after that. We just upped our game, like we always do. We do way more research now, as the internet has made it much easier to avoid crazy encounters just like that. That night, we caved and got a hotel, just to avoid any further chaos. If you're going to stealth camp, be careful. Be quiet, be careful, and be prepared for anything. When I was a kid, my dad and his buddy would take me out woodcutting deep in the Montana wilderness. My dad's friend, Uncle Kermit, drove this ancient, dilapidated truck that you could literally see through the floorboards of. The wheel wells were completely rusted out, the exhaust was chewed through, and loud as hell. It was an iconic trailer park menace, almost stereotypical for where and when we lived. Dad and Kermit brought me along, not only for my benefit, but under the guise of making me a man. The real reason was they'd have a young, able-bodied, sober hands on site for most of the grunt work. When I was really young, I think 9 years old up until about 13, I'd be the log hauler. Dad and Kermit would slog through the area, bust everything up with their saws and axes, and I'd put it all in piles and then take it back to the truck. This made sure the adults could keep moving, keep buzzing logs, and keep drinking beer, all without lifting a finger to load the truck. By the time I was older, not only was I a resilient log hauler, but I had to drive too. By the time I could see over the wheel, my dad and Uncle Kermit would take full advantage and really get to drinking. This was in the 1980s, in the middle of nowhere, Montana, so as long as the driver wasn't drunk, local deputies didn't really care if I had a license or not. They knew one option was better than the other, so I got more responsibilities out of it. I didn't really mind though, because driving the truck and handling chainsaws felt pretty cool to my teenage self. There was one particular trip where everything seemed to be going wrong. Storm clouds rolled in when there wasn't any forecast for precipitation. Then the truck started acting up, chugging at first in town, and then we realized the transmission itself was completely shot. You could shift through the regular gears, but downshifting was really hard. Shifting into regular reverse was damn near impossible. It just wouldn't slip. So we're stuck in a rambling old truck that could only go forward at only certain speeds. We were begging for trouble, and we'd find plenty of it out there that day. Everything was going per usual. 3 of us were spread out about 10 feet, each equipped with a chainsaw and buzzing everything up in sight. I wasn't as quick as the older guys, so add that to the fact that I had to pile up everything. I fell behind really quickly. We were walking along a hillside that gently sloped up to my right and then down to my left. This was my least favorite kind of terrain, short of straight uphill, I guess, because gravity worked against me. Anything that got away from me just barreled down the side of the hill, gone until I had to retrieve it. My dad and Uncle Kermit disappeared up ahead, through the brush, and then over the hillside. I could still hear their saws, though, roaring through all manner of deadfall. It was easy to keep track of each other, and the chainsaw. Saws made for good security. They were so loud that no predator wanted to get within a quarter of a mile of us, and if they did well, were 3 guys with chainsaws. We weren't really that worried about animals getting the jump on us. I came up on this absolutely massive old oak tree sprawled out through some still standing pine. It was the kind of haul that would take more than one trip with the truck. So I just went to work turning out the outer limbs into nice logs before turning my saw in the trunk. It was a gnarled tree, so I knew it was going to turn my hands into pudding, running that saw through it. Still, I started turning the trunk into rounds. There were a couple of knots up ahead, but I was on autopilot at this point, just trying to finish the minimal wear to my arms. I set the blade between a couple of the knot holes, hit the trigger, and let the sawdust fill the air around me. I could feel some rot in the wood, empty spaces where the blade passed through much quicker. After the saw padded through, I brought my boot up and kicked the round as to separate it from the rest of the tree so I could take a better look. This was the worst mistake of my life, as when I bent down to investigate the rot, a whole swarm of bats came screeching out of the hollow. They were beating against my legs, flapping up the inside of my flannel, even tied up in my hair. It was something right out of a movie, and a horrific one at that. I froze up immediately, and had the bats passed over me quicker, I probably would have been fine. I was surrounded though, As I felt myself begin to suffocate on wings and fur everywhere, I turned and panic set in. I started to stumble backwards. The hill itself sloped down and away, so as I moved backward, I started to fall. As I did that, my hand tried to find something to grab onto, and the only thing within reach was the handle of my chainsaw. I squeezed the trigger, got the blade chain spinning, and then ran the whole saw through my right calf. It was the worst pain I've ever felt, truly blinding, as I felt the teeth pull through my skin, then the fat, and finally the muscle. Blood erupted as if I tapped a fire hydrant, literally spewing down my leg and spurting through the air like a little sprinkler system. It was spraying out multiple places, so different streams shot in different directions. I imagined my veins and artery chewed to bits, so I figured there would be no way to stop the blood. I collapsed in the underbrush and just laid there for a minute, letting the shock wash over me. Things were bad, but I couldn't tell what the damage was yet. Had I broken something on the fall? It sure felt like it, and my leg was a mess. I checked myself for bites and bats and made sure they were all gone. Next, I checked out my fingers, my arms. My elbow was racked really good, but I couldn't tell if it was broken or not. It was jammed up enough that I couldn't use it to stand back up though. The chainsaw was laying behind me, idling hard, chain just a few inches from my hip. I reached over and hit the kill switch, then used my good leg to kick it a healthy distance from me. Again, I tried to use my bum arm to get up, but it was completely shot. The brush had enveloped me in such a way that it was almost anchoring me to the ground. So between my bum leg and bum arm, I wasn't going anywhere. The only option was to wait for my dad or Kermit to loop back and find me. This took way longer than I was prepared for, but felt like an hour went by. I couldn't even hear their saws anymore. I figured they were drinking and waiting for me to catch up. I started hollering through the trees calling for help that I was injured, no haul or back. It was late morning at this point. Well, I wasn't worried about overnighting or anything like that, but I was aware of how much blood I was losing. More time passed. I couldn't tell you exactly how much midday came and went. I was still alone, losing body temp now and starting to smell my own wound. I was starting to entertain the idea of death when I heard my dad calling out, and I quickly shouted back, "Try," to where I was. I could see them through the trees, maybe a quarter mile away. I kept shouting and started shaking near branches to show them exactly where I was. My dad finally got a beat on me, started busting up the hill. When he saw what happened, his face went sheet white, and he almost collapsed. He started screaming for Kermit to get up there, so they could get me shouldered and carried back to the truck. The old man wasn't as spry as my dad, plus he was completely drunk, so he really had to fight up every step of the hillside. Finally, though, he got to me and realized how bad it was. Between the two of them, they slung all 3 saws and the rest of the gear and my 14-year-old self through that forest and back to where we parked. This is where we had to make some hard decisions. Because of where my wound was, I wasn't able to bend my leg, so getting into the cab was not an option. I was going to have to ride in the back of the truck, and someone would probably have to ride with me to keep me from sliding around too much. My dad was a medic in the Army in his younger years, so elected to stay in the bed with me and treat my leg as much as he could. That left Kermit to handle the wheel. But like I said, earlier he was drunk. Uncle Kermit was drunk the entire time that I knew the guy, literally sun up to sundown around the clock. Boozing, leaving him to drive us down a pretty steep mountain road through the woods and finally into town was more dangerous than it sounded. The only advantage Kermit had was that he spent the last 60 years living rough and rural out there in Montana. He knew every road, every hairpin, like the back of his hand, not even just the roads, but the terrain and all the changes in between. He could walk from one town to the next and never take a single step off course. His sense of direction was really unbelievable. My dad got me nestled into the back of the bed, near the back window right behind the passenger seat. He cut my pants away and did what he could for my leg, elevated it, wrapped it with clean cloth, and then applied pressure. We didn't have a full first aid kit or anything, so what he could do was pretty limited. Meanwhile, Kermit did his best to get the truck fired up, then did circles until he got turned around and sat on the right road home. Remember, we didn't have reverse, so we had to be careful where we pulled in and parked. Then we were off, sailing, navigating that old piece of shit through all manner of mud, muck, and washouts. This wood run was during autumn, and in Montana, fall can get pretty cold, being in the back of that truck without a coat. I started shivering not long into the drive. My dad did what he could to bundle me up, but with the wound, my body was just shot. I needed to be inside and getting treated. Every bump sent me into hysterics from the pain, and fresh blood would start gushing out all over that dingy metal of the back of the truck. When it started to pool so much that it was filling the grooves in the bed, my dad really set to work on it again. This time, he had much better luck, as whatever he did stopped the bleeding up much more effectively. It hurt like hell, but it had my leg plugged up for the time being, as long as I didn't move too much. Things almost seemed like they were going well for just a moment, until suddenly, the entire truck just veered off the road. We're blasting through a ditch, lopsided as hell, with branches. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a truck in front of me, and I can't see it. I can't see it. I can't see it. Down the mountainside. There was probably a more legitimate medical diagnosis for this, because he would literally pass out with a moment's notice. You could be talking with him, middle of the day. His eyes would be closed, and he'd start snoozing right there in front of you, standing up and everything. It was kind of hilarious and always a sight to see. With that being said, though, it was a danger on the road. Anyone who was friends with Kermit knew that driving with him was a fool's errand. Either you had to be the one to drive, or you had to be alert enough to shake that old man awake the second he would fall asleep. That just became our new top priority, even above the fatal gash in my leg. If we crash the truck, everybody dies, not just me. I saddled up so I had both elbows hanging out of the bed, kinda wedging myself in place, but also had my left palm ready to bang on the driver's side window if my dad was by my legs, trying to keep them still, but also perched and ready to pounce against the glass the second Uncle Kermit nods off once more. It was hairy, scary, and everything in between, man. Being a kid, I actually felt guilty more than anything back there, like I put us in that situation. I felt at fault for putting us all in danger, so I wanted to do as much as I could to help avoid it. We got another couple of miles, which, on a downhill mountain road, takes much longer than a city or a town. Uncle Kermit fell asleep again, and I mean full head snap, chin to chest, snoring everything. We both saw it immediately and started wailing on the glass. Thankfully it worked and woke him up. It woke him up so fast that he didn't know where the hell he even was, and waved out the window like there was oncoming traffic or something. I had to laugh. Some shit just never changed, no matter what the situation was. After 2 more times, we were almost at the foothills of the mountain. It was only a 10-mile haul, but when you're going back and forth at 15 miles an hour, it does take a while. There was one big last curve before the grade straightened out and started to dip into the flatlands that would take you back to town. There were a few small communities between us and the hospital. Nothing that would be able to stitch me up. However, along that last curve, Kermit fell asleep, and he didn't wake up when we banged on the glass. The truck started to swing wide, really gain momentum around the bend. It was obvious that we're going to roll, and I mean any second now. The back tire already felt like it wanted to lift off the ground.